So things like the American system, it's important that we understand not just what that did, but how it was an example of nationalism. Now, however, nationalism, or the title of this chapter, rather, we talked about a few days ago, it is balancing nationalism and sectionalism. Whereas nationalism is this sense of unity and this sense of the United States being one thing and this sense of national pride and pride in the nation, association, loyalty, whatever you want to call it, to the nation over the states. What is sectionalism? Yes? Yeah, division based on your state or your region, like north and south and west and all that sort of stuff. So certainly not the same thing. They're quite opposite. And the interesting thing is, one of the ironic things is that the more that these nationalistic policies are pursued, the more that actually leads to sectionalism, because a lot of those policies tended to favor certain areas of the country over others. Things like the American system would be seen differently by different regions, and they would affect different regions differently than other ones. And so therefore, you would get some regions that liked those things and some that didn't. So it ends up, in the end, all being sort of a cycle. Another thing, we're going to get to the disagreements over some of the issues and certainly some of the things that were results of the American system and the industrialism that was taking place and all of that. We're going to get to some of those changes later this week. But another thing we have to remember is that nationalism is also reflected in expansion. It's reflected in westward expansion of the United States, people moving to Western territories, settling Western territories, and the acquisition of new territories even. We talked about that with the acquisition of Florida. Because part of nationalism, or nationalism at least, is wrapped up into this sense of Americans should go and settle west. Americans were entitled to go and settle west, that the West needed to be settled and Americans needed to go there to bring democracy and all those sorts of things. So nationalism is very much a part of that that attitude. Really always had been. That was something that, America was kind of destined for. But that too, all the westward expansion, also, while it is somehow led by nationalist tendencies and it is somehow led by nationalist attitudes, it is usually the thing that perpetuates more and more sectionalism, because that inevitably brings up questions about the West, about those new territories that North and South are never going to agree on. So the more westward expansion that we see, the more we're going to see the agitation of sectional issues and see sectional differences become a real part of the national conversation and a real problem eventually. So the first time that we really see this, or not even the first time, but the first time it's seen in this particular moment. So we have this whole era of good feelings. Everybody agrees, which of course we know isn't true. We have this heightened sense of nationalism, which again, very partly an illusion. It's not like everybody agrees with it. But then we get this sort of a rude awakening about division within the country, and we get this, sectionalism rearing its head all of a sudden, when there is suddenly a conflict over the statehood and the admission of Missouri as a new state. So Missouri, about 1820, is applying for statehood. It is the first one of the territories that have been organized from that Louisiana Purchase that Jefferson had made, roughly 15, 20 years before this. So Missouri has been organized. Missouri has become populated. It's gone through that whole territorial phase and all of that business. And so now it is applying for statehood. And it is applying for statehood as a slave state. So it is applying for statehood as a slave state. Slavery had been allowed there in its territorial phase, and so its new constitution and so forth that it is submitting allows slavery. And so that creates a huge national debate and a huge national crisis. Seemingly, not really out of nowhere, but sort of. Certainly a rude awakening to a lot of folks that may not have seen this coming. So why do you think this caused such a big problem? Yes. Exactly. If Missouri comes in as a slave state, then there will be more slave states than free. That will tip the balance in favor of slave states. It had been even. There had been kind of an unspoken, unofficial, I guess not really an agreement, but sort of an unofficial practice of admitting a slave state and a free state at the same time. That whenever you added, a free state, you added a slave state with it, so it maintained a balance of slave states to free states. I think going into this, it might have been 11 and 11. But if Missouri comes in as a slave state, it's going to tip the balance in favor of the slave states. There will be more of them than there will be free states. And so therefore, slave states' voice in Congress, their representation in the national government, all of that is going to be increased. And so that's why those free states are balking at this. They don't want to be overruled. It also kind of brings up further questions, about the rest of the Louisiana Territory, because this is also a point where they realize that this certainly is not the only territory that's going to be organized from the Louisiana Purchase. This is not the only new state that's going to come from that. And the same question is going to arise. And, free state people certainly didn't want to see this continue and all of that area be open to slavery and all of that become slaveholding territory. So there are numerous things that were creating big problems here. So Missouri statehood ends up kind of at a standstill for a while as Congress debates back and forth about what to do about it, because some are just absolutely dead set that they are not going to vote Missouri in as a slave state and all of that. So what they eventually come to, what eventually is agreed, is an agreement that becomes known as the Missouri Compromise. We talked about compromises before. What does it mean if something is a compromise? Yes. What kind of an agreement? What makes it a compromise, though? Yeah, each side gives up something. Nobody gets exactly what they want. It's kind of not seen as a perfect agreement all the way around. The chief designer of this compromise is Henry Clay. He is the one that kind of is the brains behind it and is able to orchestrate and is kind of the architect behind this compromise. How do we already know Henry Clay? He was a war hawk. What else? The American system. Big-time nationalist. Another thing you can start adding to Henry Clay's resume is compromises. He gets a reputation after this as being a great compromiser. And this is the first of several big compromises that Henry Clay is going to negotiate or be a big part of throughout his political career. He also gets this reputation for being the person who can bring both sides together and kind of work out some kind of a deal. Before we get, though, to what is in the Missouri Compromise, I want you to realize that this is a pattern that we're about to start seeing quite a lot. There's this pattern, and really we've already been in this pattern. It really is not a new thing. But where we get a conflict, usually between northern interests and southern interests, oftentimes about slavery. I guess we can even say really always about slavery, even sometimes when on the surface it doesn't look like it's about slavery. Slavery is always wrapped up in there somewhere. And then they have some kind of a conflict over it, both sides digging in their heels, and then we end up with some kind of a compromise, some kind of an agreement to sort of, smooth it over for now and move forward. So that's a pattern we're going to continue to see for quite some time. Conflict and compromise, conflict and compromise. But one of the things that I want you to notice, that I want you to look for, is that as we go along, these compromises are going to be harder and harder to get. It's going to be harder and harder to get both sides to agree to everything, because the more it happens, the more adamant both sides become that it has to be their way or nothing. And so we will see that these compromises get more and more difficult to reach, and they start to become more and more short-lived. It gets to where those compromises only last a few years. This one lasts a couple of decades, but after that, it's a little bit shorter and a little bit shorter until eventually we get to a point where nobody's willing to compromise anymore, where both sides are saying, no, we're not making any more deals on this. It's either our way or nothing. And then we all know where that's heading. So this is the first of several of these sorts of compromises that sort of, like I said, puts the Band-Aid over the problem, but it never, they're never able to really get to the crux of the matter. The way these two regions are just so incredibly different. But here's what they agree in the Missouri Compromise in 1820. One, they agree that Missouri will enter as a slave state. So Missouri does get to enter the Union as a slave state, which is what they want. And of course, the South is going to be pretty happy about that because that gives them another slave state. But at the same time, Maine is going to enter as a free state. So at the same time, Maine comes in as a free state. They will be admitted together. Missouri coming in as a slave state, Maine coming in as a free state. Now you may remember, or maybe you don't, but Maine up until this point, that most northeastern state, up until this point, it had been part of Massachusetts. Ever since the colonial period, that had been part of Massachusetts. Massachusetts was there and also in what is today Massachusetts. But they had always been rather different, and this is the moment where that breaks off and becomes its own state. So it will become Maine a free state. So that maintains your balance, and so that makes everybody kind of happy, at least for the moment. About the slave states are not going to outnumber the free states are not going to outnumber slave states. Everybody's kind of okay with that. The final part of the Missouri Compromise is where they look at, okay, what about beyond Missouri? What about the rest of this Louisiana territory? How are we going to sort of solve this dispute before it becomes another one? How do we go ahead and settle this question about slavery in these areas so that we don't end up right back in the same place a year or two later when the next territory is ready for statehood? So here's what they agree. So this is also part of the Missouri Compromise. They agree there will be no more slavery above 36 degrees 30. No more slavery, or slavery will not be permitted above 36 degrees 30. So that's a latitude, longitude coordinate, imaginary line they're going to draw out and say, okay, any new territories that are organized beneath that line, slavery will be okay there. Those are open to slavery. But any new territories that are added or settled above 36 degrees 30 are automatically closed to slavery. So even before they're organized as territories, they're already saying in those places slavery should not be allowed. The exception to that is going to be Missouri, because Missouri actually sits above 36 degrees 30. 36 degrees 30 is actually the bottom or part of the bottom border of Missouri. So it will be allowed to have slavery, but anything else in that area will not. So that seemingly solves the question about what do we do about the rest of it, before it becomes an issue. And that does kind of solve things for a while. It certainly, resolves the national crisis. It allows Missouri to come into the Union without any sort of conflict. And again, that becomes the rule for quite some time, is that 36 degrees 30 rule. But once again, these compromises never last forever. So here's what we're left with after the Missouri Compromise. So we have all of these light blue states or territories. Some of these are territories at this point, but of course those are places that are closed to slavery, either because these right here, these are all areas that were, part of your original 13 colonies, which did allow slavery in the beginning, but by this point they have all abolished it. Okay, that was something you read about in that writing assignment that you did. So by this point there is no slavery in those states. Even the ones that used to have it have since phased it out, or some of them, as we know, were abolishing it as early as the American Revolution. All of these, okay, some of these are territories at the moment. Some of them are not quite states yet, but they're close. This is that Northwest Territory. So those are states or territories that have never had slavery because it was outlawed as part of that Northwest Ordinance. So those are places where it said no slavery above Ohio River, which was right there. Of course, all the red, what are these? These are slave states or slave territories. Notice Missouri there. This is 36 degrees 30 right here. So that is the line that they're drawing, and they're saying, okay, no slavery above it, but slavery here, and this will eventually become Arkansas and parts of Oklahoma, that slavery would be allowed there. Now, looking at all that and all this unorganized, this is all, of course, your Louisiana Purchase area. You're probably going, well, why would the South agree to that? It doesn't look like they get very much out of it. That's true. However, the thinking was at this point that all of this was not going to be really useful for much of anything. A lot of people did not know at this point, or really felt at this point, that all of this was not going to be well suited for any sort of farming, much less plantation agriculture. They're partially right about that, partially not. But that's why the South would have looked at this and not seen a huge loss, because, again, they really didn't think much of this was going to be useful, certainly not for agriculture, and slavery wouldn't have survived there anyway. And that's going to continue to be kind of way they see it, but eventually they will see that as more threatening than anything else. All of this is Spanish still, and this is disputed, and we'll get to some of that a little bit later. So that's kind of what we're left with here. So at this point, we're definitely seeing, sectionalism. Sectionalism has not gone anywhere, and that's probably what the Missouri Compromise might remind a lot of people of, is that although we're in this era of heightened nationalism and all of that sort of thing, sectionalism is not gone. And in fact, like I said, the nationalistic policies tend to actually spur on more sectionalism because things tend to affect them very, very differently. We'll talk more about it a little bit later, but for example, things like tariffs. Who's going to be helped by tariffs? Who's going to typically like those? What? It's the Northerners, yeah, because it's meant to help their industries and get them off the ground and, allow them a competitive edge. Is the South industrializing? No. So they see that it's helping the North and hurting them because all they see is higher prices. All they see is just taxes on things and prices going up. And that's fueling and feeding a change that they don't want, although they do benefit from it because they're cotton and all that stuff. So it's all connected, it's all related, everything's becoming quite interdependent. So sectionalism has not gone anywhere, and we'll continue to look at that. And even some of those same people that maybe supported some of these nationalist policies, John C. Calhoun, for example, become adamantly against them when they feel like they don't benefit their particular area, their particular region. Okay.